In this video, I'm going to show any beginner how they can be off auto mode in 15 minutes by using Aperture Priority Mode. And you can do this with the camera you already own. Hello, my name is Chris Attrell. I have taught beginner photography to over 6,000 students all across Western Canada. Once you get off auto mode, there is a certain joy and excitement you'll experience that'll help you become a better photographer even quicker. The gateway to do this is to start by shooting in a semi-manual mode called Aperture Priority Mode. When you shoot in manual mode, you're setting the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO setting. In Aperture Mode, you're only going to set the aperture. You're going to allow the camera to choose the shutter speed and ISO for you. In fact, 95% of my daytime pictures are shot in Aperture Mode. The only difference is I do set my ISO most of the time, but there's nothing wrong with leaving your camera in auto ISO for now. In this video, you're going to learn why you should shoot in Aperture Mode, what it does, and how to get it set up. Further, I'm going to give you some clever tips and tricks. To begin, let's put our camera in Aperture Priority Mode now. On the mode dial on top of your camera, look for A, or if you have a Canon, AV. That stands for aperture value. Once you're in Aperture Mode, you can change your aperture to whatever you want. So what is aperture? Inside your lens, there is an iris in it, and when you shoot in what's called a wide aperture, you're opening up the iris as wide as it can go. When you shoot in a narrow aperture, you're closing it most of the way. So a wide aperture will let in more light. A narrow aperture will let in a lot less. So if you start spinning your command dial, you're going to notice some values change on your camera. These are called f-stops. The aperture is regulated by your lens. So for a kit lens that came with your camera, with the lens wide open, you can be able to get as wide as an aperture value of f-stop 3.5. And for the most narrow aperture, it's probably going to be f32. But again, it depends on your lens. There are two reasons why you shoot in Aperture Mode. The first reason is for lighting. When you shoot in what's called a wide aperture, you're letting the most light into your camera. So if you're shooting in a dark, spooky place, you want to put your camera in Aperture Mode and open the aperture up the widest. Or with a kit lens, an f-stop of 3.5. Most of my photography is shot with a wide aperture. I also have a specialty lens that has an aperture value of 1.8. That's 4 times more light than a kit lens. So if you're shooting in a dark place, shoot a wide aperture. If you're going to be taking pictures indoors, you want to shoot in a wide aperture. Just remember that the lower the aperture value, the wider the aperture. If your lens is zoomed in all the way, the widest aperture on most lenses is 5.6, which is still considered a wide aperture. They may be small values, but the amount of light they let in is dramatic. If you go from an aperture value of 3.5 to 5.6, that's double the amount of light. If you get one of these 50mm prime lenses for portraits, the aperture value on this is 1.8, which is 4 times more light than your kit lens. That's why these are highly recommended. Check out my video about 50mm prime lenses. And reason number 2 why you want to shoot in Aperture Mode is for the bokeh effect. When you want to get those really nice blurred out backgrounds, you want to zoom in and shoot in the widest aperture possible. You're going to create shallow depth of field. You notice in this picture, you can see the depth of field going across the gravel road. This was shot with a 50mm prime lens at aperture value of 2.8. If you're with a kit lens zoomed in, your aperture value would be 5.6. All that means is the depth of field would change. When you shoot in auto mode, your camera is trying to create flat images. It does not know what you want to be in your picture. But when you shoot in aperture mode and you shoot wide, you can isolate your subject, creating this magical bouquet effect. The bouquet effect does work better when your lens is zoomed in on the subject or you use a prime lens. If your lens is wide open, you may not get any bouquet effect at all. You notice in these series of pictures when we shoot a wide aperture, the background is very blurry. Then we change the aperture to 5.6 and now it's less blurry. By the time you get to f/22, there is no more blur because there's no more depth of field. So here's an exercise you can try at home. Start taking pictures of objects that are about 2 to 3 feet in front of you and the background is about 15 feet away. Then zoom in on the subject and shoot in a wide aperture. It really is that simple. And it can be even more fun. Put your camera on a tripod or stabilize it on a tabletop. Now take a picture of that object 2 feet away at a wide aperture. Then change it to 5.6. Then try 9.0. And then shoot f/16. Do you notice how all the pictures look different? All you're doing is changing the aperture value. At 1.8, it's really blurry background. This is the clock in my office. This clock is right in front of me. The background is about 15 feet away. I shot this one an aperture value of 1.8 with a 50mm prime lens. Do you see how blurry it is? Then at 5.6, it's less blurry. Try this as much as possible. And to make it even easier on you, try to find an object that has contrasting colors with your background. It shows up a lot easier on your camera screen when you have contrasting colors. And if your pictures look horrible, don't feel bad. It's not your camera settings. You may just have poor lighting. So change your angle or come back a different time of day. When you start to play with aperture mode at home, it won't take long before you can see the results. If you purposely want the flat auto mode look for shooting scenery, architecture, or going to the mountains, just make sure your lens is wide open and put your camera to a middle aperture like f/8 or f/11. You notice in this picture that the fence post, the train station, and the sky are all in focus. This gets rid of all depth of field. All you have to do is remember f/8 and everything is great. From my experience, it takes about 3 hours of people playing with aperture mode before they really get it. As a beginner, just shoot wide and f/8. When you start shooting apertures of f/16 and f/22, you may need a tripod. When I started learning aperture mode in 2008, this was one of the first pictures I ever took. This is when I got hooked. And to this day, I still prefer shooting in aperture mode rather than shooting in full manual. My next video is about exposure compensation, where I'll teach you how to brighten or darken your images in aperture mode. But if you have any questions or comments or suggestions about this video, please leave it in the comment section below. And here is a tip from my wife. Do you see this picture shot in aperture mode? A lot of people think this is a really good picture from a photographer with a lot of experience. However, it only takes about 3 hours to get this good. This is shot in aperture mode, with contrasting colors between the foreground and background. And the lighting on it is great. Thus, when you're shooting in aperture mode, give yourself a few hours of experience, knowing that you will improve. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching.